Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of Beyond Kombucha, Pu'erh, Jun, Jun, and Dark Tea. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those health benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you three great speakers. Dan Bolton, founder, editor, publisher of Tea Journey magazine. And joining Dan today are two international tea experts, Jeff Fuchs, Canadian explorer and writer, and Brendan McGill, a chef at Hitchcock Restaurant Group in Seattle. We have many questions already submitted and reviewed with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. I will come back at the end to ask some of our audience questions, but for now, I will turn it over to you, Dan.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here, and especially with two amazing people who I want to introduce now. Jeff Fuchs is enjoying himself in Hawaii as we speak. Jeff's a tea procurer, an award-winning Himalayan explorer, and an author. I've read every one of his books, watched his documentary on the tea explorer, and traveled in his footsteps for a short distance on the Tea Horse Road. Jeff lived in Yunnan province for more than a decade, and he became curious about the trade routes that were used in ancient times to transport tea from China to Tibet. He eventually became the first and only documented Westerner to travel the main strands of the Tea Horse Road. Today, he authors the Tea Sessions column for the Outpost magazine. He's led and been a part of more than 30 Himalayan expeditions and was recently voted as one of Canada's 100 greatest explorers. You'll see why. The co-founder of Jalam Teas, Jeff understands Pu'erh and dark teas. His understanding of these teas is rooted in his love for the people who craft these extraordinary beverages. He spends time with the people, understands the process intimately. And then after Jeff's presentation, Brendan McGill is joining us today, a native Alaskan with a lifetime love of cooking, fishing, and farming. In 2010, Brendan opened Hitchcock in Seattle, a restaurant with seasonal fare and pork from his own farm. And he's since expanded to Bainbridge Island, where he's speaking to us today, where he created Cafe Hitchcock. Voted People's Best New Chef by Food and Wine magazine in 2018. He's a James Beard nominee and has been recognized by Eater and Star Chefs. A fan of fermented tea for decades, this year Brendan launched Junebug Kombucha. Today we're going to learn that tea isn't just as good as it could be without fermentation. There's a striking finding in the past month by Chinese researchers who discovered that it's actually fermentation that leads to some of the refinements and some of the most sophisticated aspects of tea. They did a novel experiment in which they sterilized the leaves of tea plants by dipping them in bleach and rinsing them, and then producing the tea on exactly the same machinery from the same plants in exactly the same sequence against routine tea that had not been sterilized. And through the withering, rolling, oxidation, and drying processes you see here on the screen, we saw significant variation in the amount of fungi and microbiome and microbes. The sterilized side then yielded significantly higher theanine, which is the buffered caffeine aspect of tea that makes it quite distinctive. And as you can see on the left here, total catechins. It's a remarkable finding because certainly for the last century or so, there's been a lot of discussion about whether fermentation plays a role in the production and processing of tea. And in fact, with black tea, it does. But the findings above did not apply to green tea. So in other words, the drying process associated with green, usually it's sun-dried or dried quickly after it's plucked, prevents some of the fermentation that you see with black. But black tea is actually a process of fermentation and oxidation. If you just do the oxidation, you get tea, but it's not as good as if you do an oxidation fermentation. Two quick words about tea. Consumption's on the rise. It's been steadily increasing over the last 40 years. Certainly in the last 20, we've seen it also what we call a premiumization of tea. It's really become a much more valued product. In Canada, where I call my home, we have spent more in the last 8 years consecutively on specialty tea than on commodity tea, meaning that, the people who enjoy the tea are willing to pay more for it and are looking for unique characteristics and flavor and aspects of the tea that are often called specialty. So consumption, though, globally is really being driven by people in the producing countries, places like India and China and many of the Asian countries are substantially increasing their intake on tea. And we're talking specifically today about Pu'erh and dark tea. I'll let Jeff explain all of that in detail, but just for perspective, the column on the tall column there is the green tea that's produced in China. China is the largest producer of tea in the world, and most of the tea that China produces is green tea. At the bottom, you see exports. So China exports about 8% of the tea that it exports is black tea, about 5% is oolong tea, about 2% is herbal tea, and just a little tiny fraction is Pu'erh, which represents about 3,500 metric tons last year. What's surprising, though, is that black tea, as we'll call it, is actually second to dark tea, which is the Pu'erh and dark tea categories. So in other words, the Chinese never let it leave their country. They drink it all. They have a substantial percentage of tea produced there, about 378,000 metric tons. That'd be 3.8 million, 100 million kilos. That tea is exported in small quantities. So about 10% is exported and 90% is kept. And that trend has continued for two reasons. Pu'erh is wildly popular as a flavor tea. It's a very efficient tea. It makes a lot of pots of tea from a limited amount of product because of compression. But beyond that, it's recommended by doctors, and it's actually prescribed as you would Lipitor here in the West or many other drugs. All right, so there's a picture of dark tea, and here's a picture of Pu'erh. This circular is called the Bing Cha. And this is furrows of tea being made in what they call pile fermentation. There was a question among our listeners about how much quantity is made, and it's substantial, 378 million metric tons. So Jeff, let's take it from there.
Great. I did look through some questions, and I thought it would be a great place to start just defining a little bit about what Pu'erh is, because I think it's a tea that certainly, I think it's been deliberately mystified to some degree. I think there's been a lot of hype. So I'm going to use a quote from Mr. Luo, Nettie Luo, who's a tea scholar. He's basically spent half of the amount of time I've been on the planet in school and teaching about what pu'erh is. And he defined it very simply. And I like this definition because it kind of cuts into the middle. He basically said it has to have the flavor, or taihang hui, which is literally translated into a flavor of the sun. It has to be the big leaf material, Camellia assamica, and it has to be cultivated and produced in Yunnan. Those 3 points are kind of his sort of defining points of what pu'erh is. When we get into this conversation about the fermented aspects, the fashao, the oxidized, that's sort of an element that's tapped on to the teas after these facts. But I think it's nice to start with 3 basic points from the heart and soul of where it's grown and cultivated. And I also think it's important to explain a little bit. And again, I wish there were people from Yunnan that I've sort of interviewed over the years here to explain it, because they do more justice to explaining some of these processes and the basics of tea. They do it more credit in one sentence than I've seen articles on. They get right into the minutia of it. So this whole fermentation, the business of fermentation, the business of deliberately accelerating the age, is something that it's a relatively young thing, but a lot of it is based upon what went on during the trade route times, where you'd have these big leaf materials being transported by mule, by yak, for 5-6 months to all points of the compass. The tea horse rode and specifically went to Lhasa and to beyond, but you had the body temperatures of the animals. You'd also have the rise in altitude, elevation gain. You'd have all these elements affecting tea, creating these intense composts of tea, which in effect turned a lot of them into pungent messes, but also a lot of this aging component, which Hong Kong adopted in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the idea of deliberately aging and introducing Aspergillus, the bacteria, it brought down some of the green tea edges, because pu'erh tea at its core is still a green tea in essence. It's harvested, it's withered, it's pan-fried, it's dried. So if we're just looking at the core of pu'erh, I think it's really important to just think about it in those very simple terms. After the initial dry, that's when some of the manipulation comes in, or not. You have the raw pu'erhs, which age naturally. They don't go through any accelerated manipulation. And then you have the shou, the ripe, the cooked, which in Hong Kong they discovered by applying bacteria, microbes, increasing the humidity drastically. You could bring down some of those sharp green tea edges, which I actually happen to love. So you had a bit of that element. And just from a historical point of view, and I think it's great to bring in the indigenous groups in southwestern Yunnan, also the Mongolians, who did what they did in so many parts of the world. They not only conquered, they were masters of bringing in DNA, food. So a lot of the fermentation culture was actually introduced into Yunnan, not only via the ethnic minorities, these incredibly rich cultures of Southwest Yunnan, which buried tea leaves into the soil and aged them there, but also when the Mongolians took Yunnan into the Han Chinese fold, into what we know as China now, in the Yuan dynasty, their Turkic armies who subdued Yunnan also brought with them fermentation culture, more in vessels, in ceramic vessels. So you had an existing fermentation culture there in Yunnan. and you had these swaths of the Mongolian-led Turkic armies of conquered peoples, who not only brought fermentation culture in a little more of an elegant way, they also brought another sort of phase of eating sour foods, of eating fermented foods. And so from a historical point of view, I think it's interesting that you have this very simple raw material, green tea, that becomes in time, and it is now arguably one of the great boutique commodities. And I think it's arguable to many whether the fermentation, the ripening, the aging of the Pu'erh increases its value, increases the attractive flavor components. Many people believe that, and I might even subscribe to this myself, that the natural aging component of a raw green Pu'erh is actually a little bit more of where they want to be heading in a flavor direction. Just to add here, again, I think it's important to see that it was, in fact, places like Hong Kong, places like Taiwan, Singapore, that actively pushed, actively asserted this desire for these artificially aged teas, these fermented teas. And that in Yunnan itself, and up until my days living there in 2015, the locals still prefer tea to be what they call 有一点苦, a little bit bitter. And locals rarely drink, in fact, the fermented version of Pu'erh, of shou Pu'erh, the ripe, cooked. In Yunnan, to go to the villages that produce some of these recklessly good teas, Dabanzang, parts of Yiwu, the region of Jingmai. If you go into these regions, you will seldom see fermented teas being consumed. That's more of, even for them, something a little bit more that the international community is interested in. So some of the teas that they're consuming are these pungent, explosive flavor profiles, as opposed to these more gentle, earthy, and slightly bizarre, ripe and cooked flavor profiles that the sellers and the dealers in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore would offer up. So I like to juxtapose the modern world with a little bit of the historical context from which all of these fermented foods come from. The microbial activity in artificially aged, ripe, and these cooked Pu'erhs also comes with the caveat of a warning. A lot of the microbes that grow and are artificially promoted to grow within these ripe teas can actually increase yield, yeast and microbial content in ways that aren't good. And this isn't to poo-poo anything here, it's just a little reality check that, as always, I think one of the understated aspects of all tea sourcing is to make sure that you're buying from people, sources, and it sounds obvious, but that you trust, because storage, wet storage, dry storage, who stored it where, these are vital components, and a lot of the tea world has become sort of locked onto the idea that the older a tea is, regardless of how or where it's been stored, the better it is. And one little cautionary tale, I think, is that the longer a tea has been stored outside of your own life, outside of your own home, or sort of controlled, humid breathing room, the longer it's been stored somewhere else, you don't know the storage necessarily. So I just warn against, and just maybe words of caution against dropping huge amounts of money on reputed 30, 40-year-old tea cakes with perhaps questionable provenance. And that young teas are in fact, I think, making a bit of an assertion in the tea world right now, because they represent a closer line to the terroir, a closer line to the origin point. There's an amazing amount of misinformation, I find, and every time I'm back in China, I find that even in China, they have started rehashing some of the misinformation that we in the West started, either through ignorance, but I also think there's been deliberate hyping and mystification of a lot of the world of aged teas. And I know there was a lot of questions about caffeine for Pu'erh and some of the comparative studies. I'm not going to get into that too much here, because I don't think from a time perspective it's a great use of time. But I will suggest there's a lot of research now. There's a professor named Selina Ahmed. She's doing tremendous works on the chemistry, the actual chemistry within tea, specifically raw and ripe Pu'erh. She was at the University of Montana, phenomenal source of that technical information. One thing I will be doing at the end of this talk is providing a slideshow for those of you interested. I didn't want to take up too much of the time with images, because I'll go down a rabbit hole and you won't see me for a couple hours. I'm going to provide a slideshow at the end of this talk with some shots, photographs at some of the origin points of Pu'erh, with some of the Bulang people's traditions of burying tea, much like they do in Burma. The Lefet tradition, I think it might give some context to some of the origins of Pu'erh and how they treat the leaves. I also have provided some imagery of the trade routes, specifically the Tea Horse Road, where tea was the main commodity. And just to maybe sum it up, I don't want to go on too much, but of course I do. There is a gentleman in the slideshow, and I urge you to take a peek at the slideshow afterwards, but he was one of the legendary tea traders, and he kind of summed up the world of tea, I feel, really nicely in one little sentence. He just said, on these journeys, which took in thousands of kilometers by foot, the teas took journeys all over the Himalayas, into Pakistan, into Afghanistan from southwestern Yunnan. He suggested to me when I asked, what do you need on these journeys? And he said, well, I need the flavors. And I thought it was an odd answer to the question. And basically he explained that he needs sweet. He bought a little leather satchel of sugar. He needs sour. He brought a Tibetan cheese from yak milk called chura. He also brought a small satchel of fermented tea leaves for the body. And he talked about, of course, salt being needed and the flavor component of bitter. And I add that into the conversation, because that when I asked that question, there was nothing about I need meals, I need equipment. He talked about the flavors that he used on his great journeys across the Himalayas. And I think it was one of those really short answers that sort of summed up a lot of the food world generally, and perhaps the understated value of these flavor components, and not only in a commodity perspective, but in a medicinal way. So I will leave it there before I rant too much, but look forward to questions afterwards. And again, I will be providing a slideshow at the end of this talk to the Fermentation Association, and they'll provide a link for the images.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was great. I'm showing on the screen Junti. Our topic today is Beyond Kombucha. And Brendan will follow with a conversation about this remarkable brew. Brendan?
Hello. Hi. So, welcome. I'm excited to discuss my history relationship with this this very special style of kombucha that just resonates a little bit better for me. And you know, I think first and foremost, there's a lot of discussion about what's real kombucha and what isn't, and whether June or Jun qualifies. And I like to kind of think outside of the box of the historical relevance. In most of my research, you kind of hit a dead end. And I feel like maybe Jeff or you know, some of the other sort of tea-based experts can speak to this better than myself, but it's shrouded in mystery where these cultures originated. And what we do know is how they've been developed and manipulated in, you know, fairly recent history. Almost all cultures seem to have been discovered by some sort of happy accident, and the kombucha starter culture, you know, reportedly, much like a blue cheese, you know, if you're cooling some sweetened tea in a cave, and this sort of magical combination of yeast and beneficial bacteria, you know, landed in your beverage, inoculated it, and began to turn it into something that was acidic and enzymatic, and then grows a biofilm, or the Scoby on top. Then people were able to capture that and start replicating it outside of whatever environment that that culture was living in. So I guess to my point, what we make is just specific to what we enjoy, and I definitely don't claim any special cultural authenticity. In fact, one of the joys I've had with this is just being extremely creative, because I found that while the fermentation isn't necessarily a delicate process, it has allowed us to modify and use a lot of different inputs that it's actually a pretty robust fermentation process. So I started making this at home in 2009. This was back when most kombucha could be found in boutique health food stores in Seattle. Is sort of one of the, I guess, epicenters of Western kombucha culture. If you get enough people who are interested in health and wellness together, you start to see, it's very common to see a kombucha or a fermented, you know, June style beverage on tap in a bar or in bottles at your grocery store. And we started making this as a way to have a replacement for beer and wine that I think was really nice, to have a sparkling beverage that was refreshing and kind of bioactive. It made you feel good and a little bit, you know, your metabolism is activated. And it turned out to be a great carrier for the adaptogens and the additives that I used in our secondary fermentation to give it the flavors that it has, which I'll get into here with our process. There's a lot of talk about the health benefits of honey and green tea. And, you know, I wouldn't bore you running all those down. Most of them are well storied and pretty obvious, rich in antioxidants. There's a nice little boost of a mix between caffeine and theanine in the green tea, which is kind of that happy upper and downer at the same time, that promotes sort of this Zen-like, almost like assertive calm. And then when you add them together, the fermentation, they can put it under, you know, a laboratory analysis and show all these other compounds that are created that are highly nutritious and beneficial for your body. Probably none more important than your gut biome. The digestive benefits of drinking kombucha are probably the ones that people notice first. as it just adds a really healthy shot of probiotics into your system, which just kind of keeps everything moving and will generally make you feel better than you know, say a cold beer. So I founded this company when I was in lockdown on Maui, just right across the pond there from Jeff. And we were about 100 yards from a beekeeper who had wonderful raw honey. So in your list of sourcing, that's going to be very central to everything that I do, you want to get a raw honey, which means that it has not been pasteurized, because the enzymes in the honey and the natural yeasts that occur, I want to preserve those just as if I was making mead, because this fermentation is a combination of a traditional alcohol fermentation with yeast, but then the beneficial bacteria jump in with what's called ethanol metabolism, and they basically eat the alcohol that the yeast produces and expel delicious acetic enzymes, as well as probiotics and a host of other, you know, byproducts that make the composition of the finished product. So once you have located your raw honey, then you're going to want to buy great tea. And my experience in sourcing tea is rudimentary compared to some of the tea experts on our panel today. What I do is I go to the local store that is owned by someone who loves tea and cares a lot. You probably have a health food store in your community. Here on Bainbridge Island, we have an outfit called Willow Tree. In upcountry Maui, I would go to the Dragon's Den. Frequently, these are apothecaries that have all sorts of, you know, holistic herbs and adaptogens, as well as these teas. So I prefer an organic sencha, a Japanese green tea, for its very mild flavor. And when I get to the formula, you'll see that although this is obviously a sweet tea brew, it doesn't have the same concentration of tea that you would have if you were just having a glass of tea. So that formula I'll give you right here as a way to get started. This is very sort of colloquial, just very easy. 1 gallon of water that's been purified in some way. When I started the company, we were capturing rainwater and using a Berkey filter to make sure that it was, you know, pure. But it's quite important to not use like city water that has chlorine in it, because as that is, the chlorine's function is to kill bacteria. So we don't want to kill the bacteria in our culture, in our brew. And then the fine honey that we were talking about, you get yourself some good tea and a Scoby. And the ratio is going to be 1 gallon of water. And I would brew that with 2 tablespoons or so of a nice green tea of your choice, 1 cup of honey, and 1 cup of starter. So this is a very simple, like 1-1-1 ratio that is very easy to follow and scales very well, whether you're making 1 gallon or 100 gallons. What I do is I steep my tea at 160 degrees, as you would normally expect for green tea. It's in Fahrenheit, for about 5 minutes, which is kind of the tail end of how long you'd want to steep a green tea. And I steep mine at double strength. So if I'm shooting for 2 gallons of finished of kombucha to start, then I would steep this amount into 1 gallon, so that once I strain the tea out, I'm able to add in some cold filtered water and or ice to crash the temperature down closer to the optimal temperature for adding the honey and the starter, because you don't want to add the honey in. Unlike black tea kombucha, where you would dissolve the sugar into the very hot brew, with this, I want to let the whole tea brew come down to about warm body temperature, just over 100 degrees, before I would add the honey, as I don't want to kill the live enzymes that are prevalent there. And then also the starter. I don't want to kill the starter as well. So I add that to my sort of warm body temperature base of water brewed with tea. And then I have a not very scientific aeration technique that works great when you're making like less than 10 gallons, where you get a long whisk and you do like get a good vortex going with it, and then immediately reverse. So it'll start to get sudsy and you're getting as much air as possible all of that oxygen is going to feed the starter and feed the metabolism of this culture. Once that's ready to set aside, I lay one fresh Scoby on top, and we'll talk a little bit about propagating your Scobys. And then just, you know, we put like a piece of cloth over the top or something so that it has as much oxygen as possible. You want a large opening on the top of your fermentation vessel, sort of like the first step in making wine, as opposed to a carboy that's restricted, because we want as much oxygen as possible to be available in the primary fermentation. I give that about 7 days at 70 to 75 degrees. Sometimes that happened a little faster on my kitchen counter on Maui. Here in the Northwest, I have a hot room in our production facility that is just temperature controlled, and that keeps it right there. It takes about a week. At that point, we're about 3 pH, which is when I harvest it. And we tap that off from the bottom of these vats. You don't want to shake it and disturb it. All of the lees will fall to the bottom. A lot of yeast and sediment settles down. That can actually be really handy if you want to make some nice sourdough bread. That's a great starter for it. And then the secondary fermentation happens. If you're making it at home, you can put it directly into a flip top bottle and spike it with something else that's sweet, adding in a little more sugar so that it will convert that into yeast, or the yeast will convert that into alcohol and CO2, carbonate your bottle. And in a commercial environment where we can't have the alcohol production that goes along with doing a F2 in an enclosed container, then we do the infusion and carbonation in a bright tank, which crashes the temperature so that it really retards the process of the fermentation and still allows the flavors to infuse from like a second tea bag that we might make that has all of our flavor components. So for our root beer, all of the traditional root beer spices and bark and you know, sarsaparilla and sassafras, but also like chaga mushrooms from Alaska and matsutake mushrooms from the Olympic Peninsula. We go in with all that as well. So I'm at about at my time here, but there's so much more to talk about as it relates to kombucha and making June. We're selling these on tap at our Cafe Hitchcock on Bainbridge Island, and then soon to reopen our Cafe Hitchcock downtown in Seattle. So if you want to learn more about what we do and get some visual aids and go deeper down the rabbit hole, junebug.love is our website, and it's got visuals, more information, and where you can buy this. And I would love to take questions as we get into the next phase here. I saw some good questions from the panelists, and I see some coming in. So when we get to that part of the webinar, I'm all yours.
All right, are you guys ready for some questions? Let's start, you know what, Brendan, let's start with you. So we had a question from a beekeeper. They said honey and sugar have similar percentages of fructose and glucose. Is it the trace minerals and pollen in honey that is essential for Jun?
I would say that all of the wonderful aspects of honey are what make Jun more of a health-focused beverage for me than starting something with refined sugar. But you can make anything sweet, and you can kombucha almost any sweet medium. You know, a lot of work in this space has been done recently by Renee Redzepi in Copenhagen at the Noma restaurant, and they published a fantastic book about their fermentations that uses this process to sweeten damn near anything, or to kombucha almost anything that is sweet. So it leads us to another question. Someone asked about transitioning from black tea to green tea and training your Scoby. And I've read a lot about this. If I was starting a green tea and honey Scoby, I would seek out one that has been already trained that way. You can either kind of find your neighborhood happy hippie you know, market and see if they have one, or you can mail order them pretty successfully. As this doesn't seem like really the optimal way to find anything. because we did need a certified organic source for our commercial production, I mean, they can send them to you from Amazon, from big tea companies. And then when you have an active Scoby and some starter, let's say you just had some fruit juice and you wanted to kombucha that, no, there's no sugar or honey added. The first generation will work well with an active starter and a healthy Scoby. It's just that if you tried to keep doing that over and over, it would probably slowly die. And I've experienced this trying to, with our experiments, like, you know, certain things kill the Scoby. So you might have some success transitioning by adding in smaller amounts, you know, do like half green tea, half black tea, or, you know, a quarter at a time, and to shift it over to a different medium. But the first round seems to work really well with almost anything. So if you stack your Scobys, you have what we call a Scoby Hotel, and you keep adding sweet tea to that and draining out the liquid as it gets too acidic. I can take a nice cup of starter and put it on a gallon of anything that's sweet, along with a healthy Scoby, and it will be successful for at least one generation.
Although we had a question about where you source your Scoby.
Right. So for this project, I started with a Jun producer on Maui, and she sold her Scobies at the farmer's market. So that was sort of the first step. And then depending on where you're at in the world, as much as I try to avoid using the mail order giant, USDA certified organic live Scoby and a cup of starter in a packet can come refrigerated off of Amazon Prime for like, you know, $10 or something. Probably the most accessible way for anybody to get this going.
How does the bacteria in Jun differ from like a regular kombucha?
You know, I'm not sure, to be honest. You know, I've read a lot of the scientific explanations, breakdowns, and when I try to message that in our company to the consumer, I start to get kind of bogged down trying to be very specific about what has been proven and what are just health claims. And I think where I've settled is that it makes you feel great and it tastes good. And as an alternative to having a alcoholic beverage, it just seems to always be a better choice for me to reach for. And so that, you know, that could be probably a better question for somebody who is doing the sort of after studies in the lab. I know that honey has a tremendous amount of beneficial bacteria as well as green tea and and enzymes. And the systems that we use to make this maintain that raw nature, because I introduce it into our brew when it's not at a high enough temperature to accidentally pasteurize or sterilize those items. So anything that's in your raw honey and anything that's in your green tea will still be in the finished product.
We just had a question. Do you use herbs in it? What kind of things are you adding to it? I know you have a lot of unique flavors on your website, like a root beer flavor. What kind of things are you adding to it?
You know, when I first started doing this, well, most recently when I started this iteration of it on Maui last year, I grew a little botanical garden, and I found that I could grow my own bergamot, and it's an orange mint, right, that we all know as the kind of main flavor in Earl Grey. That seemed very appropriate. And I would just float a little sprig of that along with whatever my sugar additive was, maybe a ripe papaya from the tree or some fresh coconut water from the farmer's market, or you know, a little puree of mango, some fresh fruit, lily koi. And then that would go into the bottle for the secondary fermentation. So for our root beer, for instance, we grow chocolate mint. There's a Serious Eats food blog by a scientist named Kenji Lopez, who's he's on top of this stuff. And his root beer formula included chocolate mint, which was something I hadn't seen before. So I ordered out for seeds. We grew the herbs in our window over the winter. Now they're outside. We're harvesting them. They're going fresh into these brews. So I would just say experiment, have fun. Keep in mind that they really expand. We had a bush of Jamaican mint, and I ruined a batch of kombucha on Maui with that, at least for my family. And you know, if you're brewing with your with your family, something that my kids really enjoy doing is just tapping it right off of the tap. And I've enlisted my 6-year-old as our head taster. I'm talking about, oh, you take it down when it's, 3.0 pH. Well, he'll just taste it and say, it needs to go a little longer, Dad, And I think that you can kind of zoom out from some of the scientific aspects of this and then sort of just focus on, if you like it with a little more residual sugar, then harvest it when it's still a little sweet. And if you want it to be, bracing, bring it down to whatever, 2.7 pH, and, you'll have like this tonic. Maybe you will drink 4 ounces instead of 16 ounces.
That sounds very fun to experiment with. Kay, do you think we see so much kombucha out in, our stores today now compared to 5-10 years ago? Do you think like a classic kombucha will survive the market, or do you think it's going to be more of these unique tea variations and new flavor combinations?
I feel pretty confident that regular kombucha. I mean, Synergy brand has minted the kombucha space's first billionaire, right? So I think that they've got a pretty good share of the market, and I don't think that the new variations are gonna disrupt everything. But one of the reasons why I started drinking more kombucha was to drink less alcohol. And a lot of that had to do with a candida and a general desire to drink less sugar for my own health. And so I know that while the metabolism eats the sugar on regular kombucha, starting with a big cup of C&H, white granulated sugar, and dumping it into my drink, it feels like not the direction I want to go. So I think that if you're brewing at home, and especially if you're doing this for your health and just to have something enjoyable to drink, I mean, why wouldn't you use honey? I don't have a local delicious source of white sugar, but I have so many sources of honey available to me because everywhere people keep bees everywhere. And then you get flavors from those honeys. So if I brew with fireweed honey versus buckwheat honey or a general wildflower honey, and now that I'm falling down the rabbit hole, I mean, you can get white sage honey from, the Southwest, or like an orange blossom honey from Florida, California. Fascinating ways to keep layering flavors into your beverage and support direct. You can buy them from the people who make it.
Okay, Jeff, moving to you. Do you think we'll see more of these dark teas in North America? And as more Westerners enjoy it, how important do you think it is to understand the story and the culture behind these teas?
In reverse order, because culture is very important to me. Yes, hugely important, because I think it credits the whole line into the cup or the glass. I also think I refer back to the statement I made earlier on about at the source regions, a lot of the formal education, a lot of the chemistry isn't available to the locals, but they'll tell you by looking at the clay that this year is good. They'll tell you that the weather, the drought will actually increase the yield of certain, drop the yield of others. And I think those little snippets help to sort of put an intravenous unit right into the heart of farm to table, food to table, origin to table. Dark teas, I think, will be, I think dark teas will definitely come into they'll come into the sway more, and they'll remain. I see bartenders experimenting with teas, some not so good. But I see incredible results to some of the drinks. There are gin bars I've been to where they're actually using smoked oolongs. And the idea that they can play with these flavor compounds, I think, is exciting. And I also think it's really important. One thing that's really nice to be able to do is go to the source regions and explain how to a villager who only knows how to cultivate and produce this magnificent tea, to explain to him what's happening in the Western world or in the worlds where his teas are ending up, and showing him. Because there is that dip of generation. The next generation cultivation of tea is not easy. And I think they need to excite their own people. They need to keep this stuff in the family rather than sell it off to middlemen who live in, distant cities.
We got a question that just came through. Is Pu'erh tea, is it a flavor that you think is sustainable for Western tastes?
Yes, my thoughts. I've had some decrepit Pu'erh that is sold, for a couple thousand a cake, which I know for a fact has not been stored properly. But there's enough hype behind this sort of mustiness, which I don't think we fully understand. I think there's enough hype that there will be a phase of time where people get into it and like to compare notes. I'd like to see people just buying better tea. And by better tea, I don't mean the outrageously priced teas, but just simple teas, understanding what contributes to the flavor profile. There's sort of both sides of the fence there. I love to see tea being used for cooking. I love it being used in drinks, but I worry that sometimes these are mechanisms to get really bad product sort of hidden in another flavor compound. There's a lot of bad tea out there. And I think it's really important to understand how it's stored, again, going back to the source. So the answer is kind of I hate to do it, I'm going to go middle of the road, but it is kind of, I think it'll stay. I think it will stay.
I was fascinated looking at your website, Jeff. I'll put this in the chat too. Am I pronouncing this right? Jalam teas?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. It's so interesting. There's a new tea for each month. We had a question come through about like the seasonality of teas. Is there appropriate tea for each season and each condition? How do you balance that?
Brendan said something important, and I hear this a lot in the food. Yes, there's appropriate, and yes, there's just plain good appeal to the palate. And I think it's nice to not worry about the season so much. I think it's nice to know what the season contributes, because just as an example, theine, caffeine in tea, a lot of that is imprecise. I think the Japanese are very precise in when they're producing it, but season to season, the caffeine will differ. You'll have wild fluctuations in caffeine, not because of the production technique, just because of the seasonality. Spring teas are the vaunted, coveted teas, often very overpriced. A lot of the reasons for that just have to do with the fact that over the winter time, the lower temperatures, all of these really brilliant bits of the flavor profile wheel have a slower and more muscular sort of introduction into the plant matter. I don't get worried about the seasonality so much. I just try to pick teas that are interesting, that you can sort of take a palate journey. But yeah, I would urge, don't get caught up in buying spring and spending 3 times the amount of money. There's brilliant autumn harvests, superb summer harvests. And again, I think just finding out what our own temperamental palates go for is kind of the key.
We see so much of, in fermentation these days is experimentation. Brendan mentioned Noma earlier and all the fascinating projects they have coming out of there. Have you seen, Jeff, in your travels and studies of tea, has the practice of aging or fermenting dark teas, has it evolved from the traditional practices to explore more experimental applications?
Yes, I've seen some fascinating things. We actually had a friend of ours who buys our tea. He left his tea in a sealable bag. For me, it was just like listening to something like a horrific horror show, because I was saying, oh my God, no oxygen flex. But yes, I'm seeing people experimenting, leaving it in airtight containers. Generally, the best storage for Pu'erh, I'm going to put it out there, might take some flack, dry storage, open aeration. Tea needs the aeration to evolve. This friend of ours just put it into an airtight bag. It was awful to look at, awful to listen to, but the results were kind of fun. I'm not into sour, but this tea was off the charts sour. I've often seen in southwestern Yunnan and in Burma and parts of the northeast of India, they bury their tea in these bamboo cylinders. All they do is they harvest their leaves raw. There's no production. They boil it, they jam it into these bamboo cylinders, and they bury it in generally cold clay soils, and they dig it up. And it is a composted dish like no other. It feels like you could scrape the enamel off of your teeth after eating it, but they add it to rice. And so the longer that the cylinder is underground, the more pungent and explosive it becomes, the more coveted it is. It's more rank, and the elders will, when you talk about the cylinder that's been, in the ground for 5 years, you can just see the elders. Oh, they go into almost an ecstasy, and you taste it, and it is rank, pungent, memorable. Your palate never forgets it. But I actually think a lot of those old, going back to something about the history and the people and the culture, I have a feeling the exposure that we have in the outside world to a lot of these really simple fermentation, aging, manipulation techniques, I have a feeling they're going to play a role in where we go, because they're things we can do at home. I mean, within limits. And I think there is that sort of self-curation ability to play.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was fascinating. Okay, Dan, we had a few questions coming through on like different tea varieties like matcha, chai. Where do you see that expanding in North America? Did Dan hear me? Oh, here he goes.
Yeah, I've got that one. Yeah, Jeff made a point about something, and that's that people are beginning to understand that it's just fine to have tea. You don't have to have coloring in it. You don't have to have, a lot of bits and pieces of fruit and flowers and stuff like that. There's a genuine benefit to just understanding the terroir and keeping the tea simple. And that actually has picked up. We're seeing declines in the total volume of imported tea into the United States, for example. And part of that is because of COVID. Part of that is because of food service, using a lot less tea on offer. But part of that too is that there was an immense amount of cheap tea out there coming in, and the preference is for less of that. I tell people that the decision that Unilever made to break up its company and to divest itself of all of its different individual brands and maintain a much smaller profile is based on the fact that people actually don't want to pay less and less and less and less for tea to get less and less and less quality. They want to pay a little bit more for tea and have a better quality. So instead of a 2-cent tea bag being somehow a great achievement, a 2-cent tea bag is a failure. It's reducing the quality of the tea, reducing the experience of the people who drink the tea. And I don't think you're going to get a lot of converts to 2-cent tea, even if it's cheap. So what's the opposite of 2-cent tea? This last week, the European Specialty Tea Association, Specialty Tea Association, defines specialty tea, and they attempted to make the definition focused on characteristics of the tea and also things like, for example, sustainable packaging and environmental sensitivity, biodegradable packaging, things like that. Is they brought that into it as one of the components of specialty tea. In other words, it's not just what's in the bag; it's the bag itself and the practices sustainable, fair trade, things like that, that figure into what makes it specialty tea. So a short answer is what's trending right now seems to be authentic tea, tea that has greater flavor, more terroir, more closely married to the terroir. There's no question herbals are just racing ahead. We're seeing lots of rooibos. We're seeing a preference for non-caffeinated products. In many cases, people are sensitive to the caffeine and not interested in piling that onto their daily, in their daily diet. And then I think a couple of teas that are striking people as more interesting than they originally thought are what Brendan mentioned, the senchas. You know, I've been drinking a different tea from Japan every night as part of the Japan tea marathon. They took us to 15 growing regions, and each night we drink a tea from one of the 15 different growing regions. And you know, these are delicious green teas. They're beneficial in many, many ways, and they're obscure. They come from parts of the world where all the tea is consumed by the people who know it's good and don't bother to let it out the bag. So you almost have to know someone in Japan who's going to send you the high quality teas. But surprisingly, that's what's happening. We're seeing small retailers. We lost a lot of retailers during the COVID lockdowns. We lost a lot of people who were doing face-to-face tastings, but we gained an awful lot of people who were interested in scouring the internet for reputable dealers. You can imagine going to Jeff's website and feeling Jeff behind those choices, the sourcing that he does, and being introduced to the people who were part of that process of making the tea. And I would close by saying that aspect of tea, meaning that you're connecting it to origin, you're connecting it to a human being who manufactures the tea and grows the tea, you know, you're connecting it to culture. All of that strikes me as really not just trendy in the sense that it's a fad, but something that's actually adding to people's lives. It makes it's better for you and it's better for them. And if you can do things that are win-win across the globe, definitely do those things.
Thank you for that, Dan. And our time is up, but I wanted to thank Dan, Jeff, Brendan for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. Thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. We will post a recording of this on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. We also wanted to let everyone know registration is open for TFA's first live conference in November in Chicago. It's Fermentation 2021. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to get your ticket. We also have a number of great webinars coming up in the next few weeks, including the state of the art in coffee fermentation. Please go to same website, fermentationassociation.org, to check that out and register. And while you're there, subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.